So let's see. I get an extra hour for the sermon this morning, right? All right. It won't be quite that long. Our world today is incredibly complex, isn't it? Especially with all the technology and the media. How do we engage such a complicated world? Aren't we always looking for somebody to guide us, especially somebody that can simplify things, that can give us a few rules, a few basic guidelines to navigate such complexity? I think this is why we like the TED Talks, right? About, what are they, roughly 20 minutes long. And it's usually a specialist who has done a lifetime of study. And in 20 minutes, they get down to the bare basics and just provide a few guidelines to help us navigate life today. Well, in Jesus' day, it was also pretty complicated. But learning to follow the Torah was especially complicated. 613 commandments. How did they follow all of those laws? And sometimes it seems you were forced to violate those laws. So, what's a woman supposed to do on the Sabbath day when she goes into labor? What are the midwives to do? And are all the laws, all 613 commandments, on the same level? Is each law just as important as the other? Is the commandment to not take a sleeping blanket from a poor peasant as collateral on the same level as the commandment not to eat catfish? These are some of the things that the rabbis debated constantly. And they were often asked by the common folks, you know, what's most important? How do I follow the Torah? And in fact, Jesus was once asked this very thing. You know, he was a rabbi. He was a teacher. And he was once asked this very question by one of his arch enemies, one of the main opponents, the scribes. And that's our passage today, which I'd like to read in full. One of the scribes came near and heard them disputing with one another. And seeing that he answered them well, he asked him, "Which commandment is the first of all?" Jesus answered, "The first is, 'Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind and with all your strength. The second is this, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. There is no other commandment greater than these.' Then the scribe said to him, 'You are right, teacher. You have truly said that he is one, and besides him there is no other. And to love him with all the heart and with all the understanding and with all the strength, and to love one's neighbor as oneself. This is much more important than all whole burnt offerings and sacrifices.' When Jesus saw that he answered wisely, he said to him, 'You are not far from the kingdom of God.' After that, no one dared to ask him any question. So before looking more closely at this passage, we have to look at the literary context here, which starts at the beginning of chapter 12 of Mark. And we have a series here of controversy stories. And as a matter of fact, Mark has quite a few controversy stories that he has recorded in his Gospels where Jesus is confronted by opponents, the leaders of the Jews. And they attempt to test him and try him and trap him. And of course, we know he always wins these contests. At the beginning of chapter 12, it's the Pharisees and the Herodians. And the Pharisees are famous for saying that the whole law, that instead of the priests just having to do the laws that pertain to them and the rest of the folks doing the rest of the laws, the Pharisees were the first to say, every Israelite is a priest, and we should all be doing all of the law. So they were very strict. And then the Herodians, of course, were loyal to King Herod, and which means they were loyal to the Roman Empire. So they asked Jesus, attempting to trap him, is it lawful to pay taxes to the emperor or not? And then wisely Jesus says, bring me a denarius. And someone does, and he asks them, whose image is on the coin? And they say, it's the emperor's. So, give to Caesar what is his, and give to God what is his. The Pharisees and Herodians 0, Jesus 1. Okay. Next we have the Sadducees, which could be considered the most conservative sect in Judaism, because they believed that the Torah was inspired, but the rest of the Old Testament was not. They had trouble with the prophetic literature and the writings. So they were more conservative. They looked at the Pharisees as sort of the Mormons of their day, who were listening to these prophets and apocalyptic oracles, which they were skeptical about. The Sadducees, therefore, denied the resurrection because they didn't believe the book of Daniel was properly inspired. And so they asked Jesus a question, attempting to trap him, about what's called the Levirate law and marriage. The Levirate law was one of the laws that was followed by the Israelites to protect a man who was married but died before he could have a son who could carry on his name. And without a son, his memory would be totally obliterated. So the Levirate law was that if there was a brother of that man, that he should marry the widow and sire children. She would end up having children through him, and the first son would be named in honor of the deceased former husband. And so his memory would be preserved. So they ask a question about the Levirate law, about a woman that's married whose first husband dies, and then she marries a second man, and then so on and so forth. It goes about 7 times. Not only do they ask about the Levirate law, but in the resurrection, which one of these 7 men would be her husband? So it's kind of a preposterous hypothetical. There's no way to win with this kind of question. But of course, Jesus does. And he deconstructs their whole premise by reminding them that at the resurrection, we're going to be like the angels. And so the matter of marriage will not be a factor. And then he cinches the argument by giving proof of the resurrection. Sadducees 0, Jesus 1. Then we come to our story, and we're set up by Mark as if this is another controversy story. And here we meet the most formidable opponent of Jesus that he ever faced, a scribe. So who were the scribes? They were the PhDs of their day. They were trained rigorously. And they were the only people that could really read high literature in Hebrew, read and write in it. And during the monarchy of Israel, they often served as governmental officials. But with the Greeks and the Romans coming into power, they lost that privilege, and so they had to turn inwards, and they focused on the Torah and ended up becoming the religious lawyers or attorneys, experts on the law. So if Jesus ever faced an opponent, it would be a scribe. And Mark especially portrays the scribes as being especially antagonistic toward Jesus. In fact, in Mark chapter 6, verses 1 through 13, we get a hint of this, where when Jesus is in Nazareth, he can't perform any miracles. He's home, and he's without honor because everybody knew him when he was a kid, a runny-nosed child. And they actually they hear about all the fame that he's received because of his wisdom and his teaching and his miracles. And they call him a tecton in Greek, and the son of Mary, and the son of, or the brother of his siblings. A tecton. You can tell from the word that it's related to our term technology. And a tecton was a craftsman and was, in terms of status, was placed just above the poor peasants. So not much better than a poor peasant. This is a craftsman, a handyman, not a carpenter, because there weren't many trees in the Galilee region. Just probably a handyman that could do a number of skilled jobs that people needed done. But it was a way of describing Jesus as illiterate over against a person like a scribe who was incredibly educated. Jesus was not educated. He did go to no scribal school. But yet, time and time again, when he faces opponents like the scribes, he still outwits them and defeats them when they attempt to trap him. So here we start this story with this scribe, and it looks like it's going to be another confrontation. But things appear to be different here, because this scribe treats him like a teacher instead of as an opponent. And this is also an important theme in the Gospel of Mark. Jesus as a rabbi or as a teacher. And rabbis were expected to address such questions, you know. How do we keep the law? How do we do halakha? It's so complicated. In fact, Rabbi Hillel, the elder, is famous, who lived from roughly 40 BC to 10 AD. He was challenged by a Gentile one time who asked him, "Teach me the whole Torah while I stand on one foot." And the rabbi replied, "What is hateful to you, do not to your neighbor." That is the whole Torah, while the rest is commentary thereof. Go and learn it. So just like this rabbi, Jesus is asked by a scribe, what's the most important commandment? And it's interesting that Jesus cites the Shema. It's called the Shema by the Jews. Deuteronomy 6:4, which the children have read, is the most sacred text in Judaism. It's called the Shema because the first word in Hebrew is hear, O Israel. Hear, Shema. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is God alone. And in fact, in Jesus' day, every Jew was expected to recite the Shema in prayer twice a day. So it was very familiar to the Jews. And so Jesus citing it as the greatest commandment is not unique. But Jesus does add one word to the Shema that's not there in the original Hebrew. It's the word mind. So we're to love God with our mind. He adds that new element, which signifies the whole person is to love God and is to be totally committed to God. But then Jesus cites another commandment. He was only asked to cite one, but he cites a second one. It's also a famous Jewish commandment, Leviticus 19:18, which is the commandment that Rabbi Hillel cited earlier, which shows, again, Jesus isn't being unique. Love your neighbor as yourself. But since the scribe asked for only one commandment and Jesus gives him two, it is clear that Jesus is emphasizing that how one demonstrates love for God is by not being narcissistic and always thinking about ourselves, but turning outward and thinking about others. And not just thinking about it, but putting it into practice. Focusing on others instead of ourselves is how we demonstrate our love for God. And here the scribe agrees with Jesus. This is the only time in the ministry of Jesus where a scribe agrees with Jesus. And then the challenges end in the Gospel of Mark. There's no more testing of Jesus. Verse 34. But the scribe doesn't stop there. He goes on and he tells Jesus that these two commandments are much more important than the offerings and the sacrifices that one could offer to God. Aha. And it's interesting that this scribe earned his livelihood by those very things. The sacrifices and offerings made at the temple and the tithing of the people to the temple. That's how he earned his living. And yet, he amazingly says that loving God and loving neighbor is more important than all of that. And so Jesus responds, "You're not far from the kingdom of God." You're not far from the kingdom of God. Yet, we're not told by the text that this scribe followed Jesus. Understanding and admiration didn't make this man a Christian. He, like the first four disciples, Levi and Bartimaeus, must take the essential step of faith. He must follow Jesus. Following him means giving everything one has. As the reader is about to learn from the story of the widow and the temple and from Jesus on the cross. So, as we hear this story, as we ponder this story, we readers are meant to identify with this scribe. And those of us that are Christians in here, and I think it's pretty much all of us, we once were not far from the kingdom of God, right? But then we took that step and we became Christians. But the text still challenges us. Now we need to ask ourselves, have we remained true to the core of what the kingdom of God is about? Are we less narcissistic? Do we focus less on ourselves than we do on others? And more importantly, do we not just love others, or think about loving others, but do we put it into practice? Do we demonstrate love for God by our love for our neighbors? And I'm pointing the finger back at myself.